Good morning, everyone. I thought that maybe some of the tools and some of the experience we had in the AMSA would be useful for this discussion on EA and EBM. But when we started this assessment, of course, we had to look at the galaxy of issues facing the Arctic, which are similar today. Obviously, there's rapid climate change. We don't necessarily have to talk about the attribution, but in the context of the Arctic Council, we did this assessment on shipping just after the release of the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, so you can tell what was one of the driving forces, and also the Arctic Marine Strategic Plan. So in 2004, these two documents approved by the Arctic Council helped drive the essence of this shipping assessment. So rapid climate change, but of course, it's not just climate change and retreat of sea ice, it's global economics that drive the global shipping enterprise in every dimension, including fisheries and fishing vessels. So the linkage of Arctic natural resources to the Arctic is through transportation systems, obviously, and so that is a driving factor which is not talked about much in the Arctic Council, but it's big business. I can tell you that, we were doing this assessment on the global shipping enterprise, and who was missing in the audience? The global shipping enterprise. So we did get Maersk and BP Shipping to support the scenarios work with some heat from the diplomats, I can tell you, just talking out of school here. Someday I'll write the story, and you might not believe the novel if I wrote it. But all of these side stories were about the politics of the Arctic Council and trying to do something about an industry. And the focus, of course, is on how do we protect the place and people from this industry. Regional and global geopolitics, of course, play in all of our issues. The adjudication of the claims of the seabed, huge issue. But also the outside politics, which we know about, Ukraine and all that, and how it affects the Arctic. All of those play on human use, marine use in the Arctic. And then last, but I should not have placed it least or last on my list here, indigenous rights and how the New World in the 21st century and how indigenous people play within the context of shipping and its full range of impacts. So I think that context kind of set the tone here. What do I do here? Maybe this. Just to remind everyone that 68% of the Arctic at the top of the world is in fact ocean, and we all know that, but the rest of the world thinks it's perhaps land. And it's 2,200, 2,100 nautical miles across the top of the world, 5 times, 6 times the size of the Mediterranean, so it's not a small place. And in the EA-EBM discussion, it's a big place, right? And it's split up with the LMEs, and even the individual LMEs are larger than some regional seas. So I think scale is hugely important in all of this discussion, and it was in the AMSA because the world thought that you would just drive across the top of the world from Shanghai to Rotterdam. Easy thing to do. Of course, you have to remind people that the place is actually ice-covered through the century for maybe 9 months, either partially or fully ice-covered. Profound change in the sea ice, the thickness, the extent, whatever, but the place is still ice-covered, and that ice cover is a barrier to seamless and efficient and economically viable transport. Lots of players, lead countries, but all the countries in this case, even though led by the United States and Finland and Canada, we really had to have data and information from the 8 Arctic states, and not just data from industry or whatever, data, official data from the Arctic states. I keep hammering that point wherever I go because, there are some new assessments that have data from industry. Well, it's okay, but is it blessed by if it's done in the context of the Arctic Council, is it blessed by the Arctic Council? And so I think the same for EA and EBM. Whatever data comes in, it's a collective from the Arctic states. However, each Arctic state may have contractors or whatever, or commercial people do the work, that's fine, but they pour it into the big pool of data and then merge it. And that's what we tried to do in the AMSA. You can see we did a lot of workshops, and we had reached out to about 3,500 indigenous people in these town hall meetings. Not a lot of people, but at least an attempt to get the PPs involved in the discussion of shipping. But the biggest challenge in this whole thing is that nearly all the stakeholders, I mean the PPs and the Arctic states being the owners of the place, the sovereign owners of the place, but the rest of the world are all non-Arctic stakeholders. Think insurers, shipbuilders, shipping companies, they're all coming to the Arctic from outside, and most of them know little about the Arctic. And it's the case today as well, even though the AMSA was released in 2009. Most important point is that in red of the of this, we spent 7 months negotiating 17 recommendations. And some of the narrative was negotiated because each of the Arctic states brings, well, not all, but most of them bring their lawyers to the negotiating sessions, which is many of them done over the phone. And the lawyers hammer out definitions like the Northwest Passage or what the Northern Sea Route is. And so we had that language, of course, in the document. And so that all had to be negotiated, which really, in the end, this is approved by the Arctic Council and by the senior Arctic officials and the ministers. And it's approved, and consensus was reached on all 17 of the recommendations, and actually the narrative of the entire document, which is about 165 pages. You can see the topics, and we did have to go back in history because I think a lot of people thought this is all the new ships' modern history. And you think industrial whaling, industrial sealing, those ships were, as an industry, good or bad, and operating in the Arctic marine environment. So it's a long history. It's not just today. The ships are maybe different, more capable, but actually the ships then were pretty capable themselves. We did talk about governance. In red, I'll talk through a couple of these items. But governance, hugely important. Start with UNCLOS, talk about IMO, talk about all of the international organizations, IHO, WMO, that are involved in human marine use in the Arctic. Human dimension, of course, was the collective of the output of our town hall meetings with indigenous people, and of course environmental impacts. And infrastructure, a loaded term, which comes up at the end in the discussion, but huge infrastructure. Well, there isn't any marine infrastructure in most of the Arctic, except for the coast of Iceland, northern coast of Norway, northwest Russia. There isn't any infrastructure. I mean, it's minimal. And you think infrastructure, communications, salvage, SAR capacity, aids to navigation, a whole long list of stuff. And without that stuff, whatever EA or EBM we apply, without the infrastructure, there's no safety net. So I don't know. And then the development of infrastructure, coastal infrastructure, of course, impacts on EA and EBM. So if there's an interplay of infrastructure, infrastructure is a loaded term, but it is the thing that costs a lot of money, and it is a fundamental part of this dynamic. And right from the beginning, we had to try to define what is Arctic shipping. And as you might guess, we wanted to have a holistic view of it and count every vessel that was up in the Arctic. Hard to do. So 100 tons was our lower threshold. But nonetheless, Arctic shipping to many people, including the diplomats at the Arctic Council, was tanker, bulk carrier, going from Shanghai to Rotterdam. And I would say it's a fishing vessel and a cruise ship. So it's all the above, as you can see in this graphic. And then really the terminology, we shifted it in the PAME Arctic Ocean Review, and a better term, it's a little harder to say, it's Arctic Marine Operations and Shipping. Because Arctic shipping is a galaxy of 25 vessels around a drilling rig. That's Arctic shipping. Because if you look at Arctic shipping, for what we're trying to do for the Arctic Council, our customers, it's all about marine safety and environmental protection. So you got to know how many vessels are in whatever box. The boxes are LMEs. Just a cartoon, because early on we had data, and what we did was populate the whole region of the Arctic Ocean to not surprisingly find out that almost every square kilometer of the Arctic Ocean had been traversed by a surface ship. This is in 2004, 2005. And the central Arctic Ocean was being traversed by ships that were exploring the seabed, part of the adjudication of the claims of the seabed. So you had ships there, not many, all very ice-capable, ice-breaking research vessels, but nonetheless, remarkably, the whole place has been traversed by ships in the summer. What's missing? No international regulations for that, and that's where the Polar Code comes in. A couple of the maps from the AMSA just to point out the seasonality and the relationship of the routes around the basin in the winter in the top, in the summer, of course, a few adventures into the central Arctic Ocean, not too many, but a few. But you can see the interplay of resupply around the whole of the basin and exploration, adventure, tourism, etc. in the bottom map. A bit more today, just to bring it in the context of today. We have in Alaska this Arctic Marine Exchange, and we have 100 sites, AAS sites, for receiving the signals of the ships. And here's what 6 months of operational season, what it looks like. And you can see on the left-hand side of the Northern Sea Route, tankers, bulk carriers, cargo ships, etc. You can see in orange maybe to Kivalina and the Red Dog Mine. But on the United States side, and this is a season in 2013 when there wasn't any offshore development, so there weren't any vessels in the Chukchi Sea, hundreds of transits, etc., of larger vessels. It's all barge traffic. So it's a complex, but it's a 6-month pattern, and the map is a little deceiving. If you look at the data, the maximum number of ships in the middle of the summer in July in Bering Strait is 3 ships. 3 ships, that's the intensity. This is not the English Channel, or you pick another place. However, there is traffic, but we should take a look, and this again complements the seasonality. That's the traffic in the wintertime in this part of the world, Bering Strait. This is the picture it'll look like through the century and beyond, seasonal traffic. To think that there will be vast numbers of ships like the English Channel in this part of the season is a bit of, it's not even in the range of plausibility. It's fantasy. So why? It's not economic. You got to go 2,000 miles across the top of the world in darkness, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the seasonality issue, as portrayed in this kind of data, hugely important to the EBMs and the AEA approach because of the seasonality. Now, of course, you can look at the seasonality of indigenous use. That's a different picture because there's seasonal use on the ice. I threw this slide in, I don't know, for Jackie or somebody else, and for everybody. It's fascinating that this international strait with rights of innocent passage, etc., is covered by, however you define it, sensitive areas. And these are AMSAs, but nonetheless, when you apply all of these measures and tools to a place with all of that traffic, at least in the summer, it does point out some areas of potential policy issues and conflict, and et cetera. Because no state, maritime state, is going to have restrictions on navigation through the middle of the Bering Strait. The leader of it will be the United States, right? I mean, because we reject power, and we have our interest in a state like Denmark. Freedom of navigation, number one thing. So in this, just to sum up, in the AMSA, we had this scenarios work, which I think has applicability to EA and EBM because it handled complexity and merging issues. So we had the brainstorms, and we teased out about 120 drivers. They could be considered uncertainties, issues that would impact the global shipping enterprise within the Arctic. So you can look at them all, and I starred the oil prices because Dennis will remember all of this. He participated in the scenario development. The price of oil was $147 a barrel at the beginning of the AMSA. At the end of the AMSA, it was 55 to 60, and yesterday it was, 39, 40. So just that one factor can impact, obviously, shipping traffic in the Arctic. When you think of offshore development, either present or not, and eventually tankers carrying natural resources out of the Arctic on destinational voyages. But then we did have a shipping accident. It happened in the Antarctic during the AMSA. It was the sinking of the Explorer, which had just been in the Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic, 6 months previous. So that helped us. Just for 5 more minutes? Okay, good. And then you can see shift to nuclear energy. Because during our discussion, we said, well, nuclear energy is coming. We weren't smart enough and clairvoyant to think that the Japanese disaster would happen, right? And then after that, the Chancellor of Germany says we're out of nuclear. So, but our point was in this is that nuclear energy is coming. There'll be less offshore Arctic oil and gas development, and maybe fewer ships. So you don't get everything right in this. But you can see the galaxy of the issues: marine insurance industry, legal framework, new players, China, Japan, and Korea wanting to play in this as they would in LMEs and populating whatever marine use is. So I think there's some complementary issues here. These are scenarios. This is our somewhat iconic matrix. But the two major drivers that we identified are governance, which has a great relevance for EA, for sure. But then our driver was natural resource development and trade. Some might like to put sea ice retreat. But sea ice retreat, profound as it is, really just increases marine access, increases the potential for longer seasons of navigation. But the real driver in anything Arctic shipping is related to economics and natural resource development, tourism. So these scenarios were useful because we were trying to educate the Arctic Council, the Arctic states, and the diplomats, tough customers, a little different group to deal with, and to some extent the indigenous people, the PPs, and a whole range of stakeholders in the Arctic Council. Identifying the drivers, the key uncertainties was important, and identifying how all of this linked to the global system, which in fact EA, EBM has to identify how does all this link to the human use of what we're trying to communicate. And then finally you get an integrated view, presumably of marine navigation. Here are the linkages that we identified to the global system in terms of fishing. About 10% of the world's fishery comes from the Arctic, et cetera, all these hard minerals. The hydrocarbon data is from the USGS study. Rare earths. We did look at fresh water, tremendous fresh water in the Arctic. Bulk carriage of fresh water to the world is plausible and is economic. Today, this past summer, bulk fresh water came to Barcelona from internal in the Med. So if you can make money doing that, you can make money taking bulk fresh water from Russia, Canada, maybe the United States. We send bottled water to Japan here in Alaska. So it sounds fantasy, but it's plausible from a shipping standpoint. Let me finish up here. That we have 17 recommendations, but of course to market those recommendations, like marketing EA, is how you do it in thematic ways. And so this is our kind of gouge to do that. And while the safety issues and the people issues are hugely important, equal in this is this Arctic marine infrastructure, because of its absence and because of its cost. That those are highly relevant, I think, to what we're talking about here at the conference. It's a little messy here, this diagram. It's just to convey that lots of things have been done: SAR agreement, environmental oil spill preparedness and response agreement, atlas for the eco-significant areas, etc. But still a lot more to be done on invasive species, oil spill prevention, emissions questions, and really it's the infrastructure deficit that needs lots of attention. Observing systems, of course, etc. And I'll just finish up. Lots of new maps just to confuse, well, not to confuse, supposedly not to confuse, but if you overlay them all, even SAR over the LMEs, And the new polar code over the LMEs, it's just a new layers, I think, of complexity. Not that it can't be all worked out, but this one here is huge because it's a new regime, at least for vessels in the Arctic, and it overlays UNCLOS and the LMEs. The AMSA baseline assessment, of course, the numbers can be retooled in advance. I actually think if you did this survey today, you'd find fewer ships in some areas, not more. The ice is still retreating, but economics is driving the offshore development. You would find fewer ships. This is a policy document and framework, strategic guide. One more. Yeah, I think this is just a couple comments about the applicability of what we did to the discussion at hand today. We were looking at complexity. We were trying to integrate marine use, imperfect as it was. The scenarios were useful. I think you could use scenarios in looking at EA and EBM, and then the negotiated framework that we developed. Then just one final slide to show passive microwave integrated images for the winter to remind us all and try to communicate to the rest of the world. The place is ice covered through the century and beyond. And from a maritime use perspective, hugely important to remember that. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, but to the rest of the world, in the conferences that I go to in Singapore or whatever, they really believe that it's ice-free for a greater part of the season. Thank you.